This channel is supported by Truefire.
Well, what is this all about then? It's the Truefire Summer Music Festival. What I'm going to tell you about, you can get 1 month of All Access for just $1. The All Access, you can dip in and out of every single course on Truefire, so that's a really great way to get some awesome courses down you.
I saw there was a Brett Pupper with Tom Bukovac video that at the end of it, there was like a tiny little bit where they were still talking about there was some affordable vintage gear. And it kind of got me thinking, you know, what is vintage gear really? You know, is this all hype? Is there something to it? Does vintage gear need to be unaffordable? You know, there are pieces of gear which I think of as vintage at this point. I think people's definitions may differ on what vintage is, so feel free to leave in the comments what you kind of define vintage as. In some circles, I think something over 30 years might be the thing, but I also saw there was this kind of article from George Gruhn on his site. Is that how you say it, Gruhn? And he was kind of actually less concerned with vintage as a phrase, but more golden era guitars. And I thought that might kind of shine some light on what some of this hype might be about. So for this vintage guitar boom to have happened and all of this sort of stuff, it's happened over decades. I think what has to happen is that what this golden era thing is defined as like a period where something was made in a certain way, got a certain amount of prestige, and then something happened. Basically like the pre-CBS Strat kind of thing kind of encapsulates it perfectly, right? Where you got like this sort of 15-year period nearly of production, and then it has a very fine and clear cut-off point, well, pretty much. So George Gruhn said this: "When I opened the doors to my shop in January 1970, people did not use the term golden era, but we were well aware of the profound difference between the current new instruments and used instruments of certain periods. We considered post-1965 Fenders and Gibsons to be very poor, but we recognised Martins up until 1969, with Brazilian rosewood in brackets, as superior to those from 1970 onward. In fact, it has often been said that the new instruments of the late 60s and early 70s were of such poor quality that they were what created the demand for vintage guitars. Prices were lower then, of course, but in 1970 the most desirable vintage pieces already cost twice as much as new versions of those models. So even in 1970, vintage pieces, which were like what, 7 years older. Anyway, 38 years later, whenever he was writing this, little has changed except prices. The vintage market has boomed at times and stagnated at times, and economic, social and musical trends have changed dramatically over the years. Nevertheless, collectors and musicians today are still looking for the same instruments they were looking for in 1970. In other words, there have been no additional golden eras for fretted instruments in the last 4 decades, with the possible exception of Jimmy DeQuisto's innovative archtop guitars of the late 1980s and early 90s. Why are there no new golden eras? We should first identify the long-established golden eras for fretted instruments. Pre-CBS Fender guitars and basses from 1950 to early 1965. Instruments made from 1950 when the Broadcaster, soon to be Telecaster, and Esquire were introduced until Fender's acquisition by CBS at the beginning of 1965 are viewed as the ultimate Fenders. In the opinion of most players as well as collectors, these early instruments remain to this day unrivaled in tone. And then it kind of says what makes a golden era instrument. If we look for a unifying theme among these so-called golden era instruments, it becomes apparent that they are not only superbly made instruments that sound great and look great, but they are clearly not copies of instruments that came before them. I guess that's interesting, because this is, why things like my K-Line Strat or even the Natros or whatever are not going to be considered golden era or vintage in the same way you presume, because they're not, because they are copies. These instruments introduced innovations that brought the design of their respective instrument types to perfection, such that these designs have yet to be improved on. I guess that's kind of subjective, right? Then they maintain their status by virtue of their quality. It's also quite remarkable how brief a time span the golden era has been for many of these makers, how they apparently did not recognise the perfection of their designs, and how soon they made changes that brought their golden eras to an end. And for instance, like with Leo, with Music Man and GNL, unable to in some ways replicate the perfection that some people see in the 50s to 60s guitars. Obviously, what human hands did once, they should be able to do again, but today's makers are having increasing difficulty getting the materials that were available to the golden era makers. They were able to get old growth lumber that was air dried for at least a decade. Today, almost all the wood available is second growth and not well seasoned, so virtually all manufacturers use kiln dried wood, which is not nearly as stable, nor does it sound the same as the old style air dried, well seasoned wood. In addition, few makers today use hide glue, and the lacquer formulas available today are quite different from those of the 1920s through the 1960s. Vintage reissues are coming closer to the originals, and in the case of archtops, the level of cosmetic craftsmanship, not tone, by many of today's makers far exceeds that of D'Angelico and Stromberg. However, the focus on reissues is in itself a sign that makers are not actively pursuing the kind of innovations that could lead to new golden era. I don't know, I thought it was an interesting sort of bit of stuff from George, and maybe that is, a valid point, like we might be living in a golden era of reissues. I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about. Whilst there is not necessarily, Fender might be part of that, but also don't forget, like, all of the boutique builders, Dano casters, the K-lines, the SVLs, the great world of boutique builders that are, paying homage to the great. The other thing to say is that not all vintage gear is as expensive. Like, you can get a Jazzer for sort of under $5,000. So is that maybe, or like a Duosonic or something like that. The other thing I remember Paul Reed Smith saying is that really you're looking at gear that no longer has the original frets anyway, so you're not even comparing these vintage guitars as they came out of the factory, right? They've mostly been worked on. So like for instance this Tokai Gold Star Sound, I think is about 1987. it's been re-fretted not particularly well, and that kind of colours my judgment of the guitar. But there's probably great potential in this one. I think I'm going to take this one to Jeremy at Garland Guitars. But to be honest, I obviously it's a very small amount of people that really get to enjoy vintage guitars, but I think this has original frets on it. For sure, I think there's something very romantic about this idea, but I think we all probably equally realise that a golden era Fender, probably, you know, quite a lot of these boutique guitars that are more accessible and that don't cost quite as much, you know, not 30 grand or whatever it is that you pay these days, can certainly do a great job. And, you know, maybe they'll never appreciate in value in quite the same way, but you know, you might be able to actually afford one. Interestingly as well, the piece of gear that Tom Bukovac was talking about, it was actually a Roland Jazz Chorus, which was like 1975 was when that came out. And he was saying that those vintage amps are still like relatively affordable and sound great. And that's not even a tube amp, and it's way past the golden era of some of this other stuff. So I do think there is a point to this, like your favourite guitar builder may have had a golden era, maybe in their golden era, just because the Fenders, like, on average maybe are not great. And also don't forget what PRS have said about this, which was that, you know, modern guitars are better made. I don't know whether that's true or not. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Cheers for stopping by.